It was one of those moments a mother never forgets. I stood in the doorway of my small apartment, rent notice in hand, while my own son, my flesh and blood, chuckled and said, "Well, maybe it's time you stopped pretending you're independent." He didn't say it with malice, but he didn't say it with respect either. What he didn't know, what he never thought to ask, was that the rent he thought I couldn't pay was money I had quietly been funneling back into my own account. Because for the last 15 years, I'd been the sole owner of the building he thought I was barely surviving in, and I had my reasons for keeping that quiet. Until now. My husband died when our son Jordan was only 10. It wasn't sudden. It was the slow kind of goodbye. Cancer. The kind that drains savings, strength, and softness all at once. We got through it because we had to. Jordan was too young to carry the weight, so I carried it alone. Back then, I worked 3 jobs: grocery clerk in the mornings, school receptionist in the afternoons, and catering on weekends. I didn't complain. I didn't cry in front of him. I just kept going. We lived in a rent-controlled unit on the 2nd floor of a tired old building in Westgate. Nothing fancy, but it had strong walls and a roof that held during storms. It was owned by a kind woman named Miriam who lived out of state. When she passed, her son wanted to sell fast. I was 39 years old, with a good tenant record and a modest inheritance left from my husband's life insurance, barely enough for a down payment. But I made the call. I mortgaged what I had, took out a business loan, took courses at night to learn what I didn't know. The sale went through quietly. I didn't tell many people. I kept the rent low for the tenants and hired a local company to handle the management in my name. I stayed in my own unit just like before, still paying rent, still quiet. Jordan never asked much. He assumed, as he grew older, that I was just surviving. And I let him. He went off to college, made something of himself, married well, and moved into a bright townhouse across the city. We talked. We stayed close. But over time, I noticed a shift. He stopped asking questions. He started assuming. When I mentioned once that the new heating system in my unit cost more than expected, he chuckled and said, "Well, you could always move in with us if you swallow that pride." It stung, not because of the words, but because of the tone. He saw me as fragile, dependent, outdated, and he had no idea I was the one signing the paychecks for the men who fixed his building's elevators. I never corrected him, but life has a way of offering its own clarifications. And Jordan's would come the day he laughed at his own mother. Over rent, I never needed help paying. Jordan visited every few weeks, usually rushed, usually distracted, always dressed for the next thing. He'd hug me, half listen, glance at his phone during lunch. I never took it personally. Children grow up and forget what held them together. That's part of the job. But over the past year, those visits began to feel different. He talked more about efficiency, about how I should let go of the past, downsize, sell off old things, and maybe stop being so stubborn about independence. It was never said cruelly. That's what made it worse. It was dressed in concern, dipped in condescension. Then came the moment that rewrote everything. It was a Tuesday. I had just received a maintenance invoice for roof repairs, nearly double what I'd expected. I sighed and mentioned offhand at lunch, "These costs are creeping up more than I thought." Jordan looked up from his phone and laughed. Not loudly, just a soft, smug chuckle. "Well, maybe it's time you stop pretending you're managing on your own." I froze. There was no malice in his voice. That was the part that hurt the most. He genuinely thought I was struggling. A woman who owned 4 units in a high-demand corner of the city. A woman who had quietly reinvested every surplus dollar into repairs, tenant support, and legal buffers. A woman who had kept her name off the building records publicly for privacy, but who, in every real way, owned the deed. I didn't respond. I simply smiled. And that night, I walked through my building like I always did, checking stairwells, speaking to tenants, making a mental list of needed touch-ups. The walls were familiar. The hallway creaks were like a second language. These weren't just floors and units. They were chapters of my life. Mrs. Callahan on 1B had lived here since 1992. She still left flowers at my door on my husband's death anniversary, never asking how I was, just remembering. The Dominguez family on 3A had grown from a couple to a household of 5. When their boiler broke 2 winters ago, I had it replaced in a day, on my dime. They didn't know I was the landlord, and that was by design. I never wanted to be the person with keys and power. I wanted to be a part of something solid, quiet, lasting. But Jordan, my son, had mistaken that quiet for weakness, and the longer I stayed silent, the more he mistook it for helplessness. A week later, he called, said he'd been talking with his wife about my situation, that they could help by having me move in with them, just until I got back on my feet. I let him finish. Then I said, "Thank you, but I'm quite stable where I am." He chuckled again. "Mom, come on. It's okay to ask for help." I wanted to tell him everything at that moment. The name on the mortgage, the management company, the tenants who respected me, the security accounts. The retirement plan was built brick by brick from years of discipline. But I didn't. Because sometimes the best lessons are learned through quiet revelation, not correction. So I waited, because something told me the moment would come. And when it did, it wouldn't need an argument, just a signature. And silence. 3 weeks after that phone call, Jordan showed up unannounced, his wife in tow, wearing a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They brought lunch, which was thoughtful, and a binder, which was not. I knew the moment I saw it on the table that this wasn't just a visit. Jordan cleared his throat and began. "We've been thinking, Mom. You've worked hard. You've carried a lot. And maybe now it's time to start making things easier." I sipped my tea. "Easier? How?" His wife leaned in. "There's a lovely assisted living condo unit just 15 minutes from us. Not a facility, more like an active community. You'd have your own space." Jordan added, "It's just practical. Your rent keeps going up. Your building's old. And if something ever happens, we're far." He said, "Your rent" again. That word, rent, sat heavy between us. I looked at the binder. It was organized, color-coded, with brochures and financing options. Thoughtful, yes, but it was. A plan built entirely on an assumption that I was barely hanging on, that I needed to be rescued. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly, "but I'm not ready for that kind of change." Jordan's smile tightened. "Mom, come on, you don't have to keep pretending." His wife reached out and touched my hand. "We know it's hard to accept help, but pride isn't worth suffering." That word again. Pride. It wasn't pride that had kept me quiet. It was a principle. It was the belief that you don't need to announce your success to make it real. That strength is often silent. I didn't defend myself, not yet, because they weren't ready to hear the truth. But the universe, as always, had its own timing. 2 days later, the property management company sent out a notice to all tenants, a general update about routine maintenance, upcoming inspections, and a new emergency contact procedure. For the first time in over a decade, the notice carried a name. Mine, typed cleanly at the bottom. Property owner, Margaret Ellison. Mrs. Callahan from 1B called that evening. "I didn't know," she said softly. "All this time?" I smiled. Some things don't need to be said to be done right. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, Jordan called, his voice lower, cautious. "Mom, I just saw a notice at your building. Your name is on it?" "Yes," I replied. "You own the building?" "Yes." Silence. Then a stunned exhale. "Why didn't you tell me?" I paused. "Because I was waiting for the moment when you'd learn the difference between helping someone and looking down on them." He didn't argue, didn't laugh. He just said, "I think I owe you an apology." And for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not as someone fragile, but as someone whole. After the phone call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, tea gone cold beside me, the sound of the old refrigerator humming softly in the background. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even relieved. I was reflective. 17 years. Ago, when I signed the papers and bought this building, I didn't imagine it would become the setting for a lesson my own son would one day need to learn. I didn't buy it to prove anything. I bought it because I knew that security for a woman like me didn't come from depending on others. It came from owning something no one could take away. And yet, for all those years, I had let Jordan believe I was renting, just a woman scraping by, holding on with stubborn pride. I hadn't corrected him because part of me wanted him to grow into the kind of man who asked deeper questions, who didn't measure worth by appearances or assume need where there was quiet. Instead, he'd chosen convenience over curiosity. That's what stung. Not his suggestion that I move in, not the binder filled with glossy brochures, but the way he'd built an entire image of me based on surface-level assumptions. How quickly he forgot who raised him, who rebuilt life from the ashes of grief and debt, who paid his tuition without ever mentioning how hard that money was earned. He forgot my strength because I had never needed to raise my voice. But perhaps that was my failing too. Women of my generation were taught not to boast, to provide, to endure, to stay quiet. But maybe silence, over time, looks too much like weakness to eyes that never needed to know the difference. Jordan wasn't cruel. He was just blind to everything I'd chosen not to show. But now the veil has lifted, and the shift was immediate. He called again 2 days later, this time without hesitation in his voice. He asked about the building, the tenants, how I got started, how I managed it all without saying a word. I answered every question. Not proudly, not defensively, just truthfully. And when he came by next, he hugged me longer, looked around the apartment differently, asked if I needed help, not because he assumed I couldn't handle it, but because he finally respected that I had. The next few weeks felt different, like a layer had been peeled back from our relationship. Jordan began calling more often, not with advice or thinly veiled suggestions, but with genuine questions. He asked about the property, how I handled lease agreements, what kind of repairs cost the most, how I'd learned about real estate in the first place. He listened, really listened. It was the kind of listening I hadn't felt from him in years. Not since he was a teenager sitting at the kitchen table asking how to balance his first checkbook. It stirred something in me, not pride exactly, but quiet affirmation. He was seeing me again. Not as a woman needing rescue, but as a woman who had quietly held her world together when no one else was watching. He even stopped by the building, unannounced one afternoon. I found him in the lobby talking to Mr. Patel from 2C about the mailbox hinges. He turned when he saw me and smiled. "Thought I'd get a look at the empire," he said lightly. I smiled back. "It's not an empire, just a building." He nodded. "Maybe. But the foundation's solid, like its owner." Later that evening, as we sat in my living room, no binder between us, no agenda, he said something I'll never forget. "I thought I was helping you by offering a way out," he said. "I didn't realize you'd already built your way in." That was when I knew the shift was real. He wasn't just revising his assumptions. He was unlearning them and replacing them with respect. It didn't erase the sting of his earlier laughter, but it softened it. And more importantly, it showed me something vital. People can grow. Even our children. Even when they're grown. Themselves. Especially then. We don't always get the acknowledgement we deserve in life, especially as parents. But sometimes, when the moment's right and the lesson lands not with force, but with grace, we get something better than validation. We understand. And that, finally, felt like enough. Just as things seemed to find a peaceful rhythm between Jordan and me, an unexpected letter arrived. Official stationery, return address from a local developer's office. It was a buyout offer, direct, aggressive, and higher than I'd expected. They wanted the building, badly. The letter praised the location, the untapped commercial potential, and hinted that the neighborhood was evolving. A familiar code word for pushing families like mine out and putting coffee shops and luxury condos in their place. I sat with the offer for a long time, not because I was tempted, but because I understood what it meant. Someone had seen what I'd built and saw only profit. Not people, not stories, just square footage and future revenue. I called the property manager, who confirmed that the developers had been circling for months. They're offering tenants incentives to break leases early, she said, trying to hollow it out before making another push. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not fear, but anger. The quiet kind. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my tenants, my neighbors, the people who had lived under this roof with dignity for decades. They didn't need to be uprooted for someone else's bottom line. That night, I mentioned it to Jordan. He looked thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Is the offer good?" he asked. I studied his face. "It's generous, but that's not the point." He nodded, but slowly. "Mom, you've done well with it. You could sell and live comfortably for the rest of your life." It wasn't a bad question, but it was the wrong one. "I already live comfortably," I said, "because I don't measure comfort in cash offers. I measure it in continuity. Community. Security for people who don't have backup plans." He exhaled. "You've always been better at seeing the whole picture." I gave a faint smile. "Because I've had to." But I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of conflict. A part of him, perhaps, that still leaned toward the logical, the efficient. The part of him that had once offered to move me into a smaller place with help. The next day, I received another letter. This one wasn't from the developer. It was from a law office representing two tenants, young couples who had received early exit incentives and now felt pressured to leave. They were afraid, and I knew then the quiet phase was over. This was going to be a fight. So I did what I always did. I got to work. I compiled every lease, every clause. I consulted a housing advocate I'd met years ago during a tenant rights seminar. I attended local zoning meetings, took notes, and asked questions, and I began speaking to my tenants, not as a landlord, but as a neighbor. I let them know the truth, that I wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. Word spread through the building faster than I expected, not just about the developer's offers, but about my response. Tenants who had once greeted me with polite nods now stopped. Me in the hallways with questions, concerns, and hope. "You really own the place?" Mrs. Callahan asked, eyebrows raised, hands dusted with flour from her morning baking. "I do," I said simply. "And you're really not selling?" "I'm not." Something changed in her face. Not just relief, but pride. With the help of the housing advocate, I began organizing tenant meetings in the basement lounge, folding chairs, handwritten agendas. It wasn't polished, but it was powerful. For the first time, people who had lived alongside each other for years began talking, openly, urgently, and with a shared goal. We discussed legal protections, lease renewals, language hidden in the developer's incentive letters. Together, we drafted a collective tenant statement. No one would accept an early exit offer. Not until they had transparency. Not until they understood what was really at stake. Meanwhile, the property management company received another letter from the developer's legal team, this one more forceful. It implied that continued resistance may lead to more aggressive acquisition measures. I forwarded it to my attorney without blinking. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. I answered without hesitation. I've been ready for 17 years. Still, not everything could be solved with documents and meetings. Tensions rose. One family packed up in the night, afraid of pressure they couldn't prove. A maintenance worker I'd known for over a decade quietly quit, not wanting to be caught in the middle. And then, one morning, I woke up to find a note slipped under my door. No name, just words written in tight, slanted pen. "Don't be the reason we all lose our homes. Sell, please." I stared at it for a long time. It didn't shake me, but it reminded me how deep fear runs when people have seen how often promises turn to dust. That afternoon, Jordan visited. He stood in the doorway and said, "I read about your meetings. You're making waves." "I'm doing what's right," I said. He nodded slowly. "I know. And I want to help." I looked at him carefully. "Help how?" "I've been learning a lot lately, Mom. and I think it's time I stop assuming. I know better. You've built something worth protecting. And just like that, I felt something shift, not just in the building, but my son. With Jordan's help, things began to move with more clarity and force. He wasn't just apologizing anymore, he was showing up. He helped me navigate city ordinances, connected me with people in zoning, and sat beside me in every community meeting, not as a savior, but as a student. The tenant alliance held strong. No one else left. Those who had accepted early incentives rescinded their agreements after learning how misleading the developers' promises were. The community gained confidence, not from confrontation, but from unity. And when the developer sent their final offer, nearly double the first, my answer remained the same. No, we weren't for sale. 2 months later, the developers quietly withdrew. No lawsuit, no press. Just silence. They had moved on to another block, one less stubborn, one less organized, one less owned by someone who had roots deeper than their profit margins. I stood on the building's front steps the morning after the withdrawal notice came in. The sky was clear, the bricks warm with morning sun, the hallway behind me echoing. With the sound of children laughing, I thought of all the nights I lay awake wondering if I had made the right decision years ago, buying this building when everyone told me to rent, to shrink, to stay small. Now I know. I hadn't just bought a structure. I had built a sanctuary. Not just for me, but for the many. Jordan stepped beside me. So what now? I smiled. Now we maintain. We grow. We keep protecting what matters. He nodded. You? No? If you ever want to put the deed in both our names, I'd be honored. I looked at him, steady and warm. Not yet. You're still learning. He laughed gently. Fair enough. The victory wasn't loud. It wasn't televised, but it was complete. And best of all, it was ours. People often think power looks like wealth, like title plaques on doors or big bank accounts. But the most lasting kind of power is quiet. It's built over years of showing up, making hard choices, and standing firm when it would have been easier to fold. I never wanted applause. I didn't need my son or anyone to admire what I'd built. But I did hope that one day he'd understand it. That he'd see past the chipped paint, the aging elevator, the modest apartment, and realize that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly and endures. Jordan's laughter that day, the one that started it all, no longer lives in my heart as pain. It lives as proof. Proof that sometimes our children must misunderstand us before they're ready to respect us. And when they finally see us clearly, not just as parents but as people, it's like being seen for the first time. I didn't just teach Jordan about buildings or leases, I taught him about backbone, about how dignity doesn't require wealth to exist, about how ownership isn't about showing off, it's about showing up. He sees that now, and he's changing because of it. But maybe more than that, he's listening, and in the end, that's what we hope for most as mothers. That all our quiet labor, our invisible strength, the way we hold families and futures together, will one day be recognized not with trophies, but with truth. And maybe, just maybe, passed on. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever been underestimated, misjudged, or dismissed, know this. Your quiet strength matters. You don't have to explain your worth to anyone who hasn't taken the time to truly see you. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that real power often comes dressed in humility. Leave a comment with the moment you reclaimed your dignity without raising your voice. And subscribe for more powerful, soul-stirring family dramas where quiet triumph wins the day. Because in a world that praises noise, we honor those who rise in silence and stand unshaken.